All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Kyle Rempfer from armytimes.com. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
I appreciate you joining us today. Now, the piece is called 8 Green Berets Quietly Disciplined After Afghan Prisoners Beating Death. So, very important story about a guy who was essentially murdered here on October the 22nd, 2018. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And the guy, it says here, an Afghan commando. So this is not Taliban. This is a green on blue attack, as they call it, right? Someone who worked for the friendly Afghan forces.
Yeah, that's right. You know, any of your listeners who are veterans, and probably a fair number who aren't veterans, are familiar with this. It is kind of a hallmark of the Afghan war, these insider attacks where Allied forces would basically turn their guns on U.S. or NATO troops.
Mm-hmm. And now, so what happened was who did he kill?
So basically, he turned his gun on some Czech special operators who were driving onto this base called Shindan Air Base in western Afghanistan one afternoon. And he shot the rear vehicle up, and he killed one Czech soldier and then wounded 2 others. And then not long after that, the Afghans basically called over to the American base and said that they had the guy in custody, the guy who had done the shooting, and they were ready to bring him over for questioning by the Americans and by the Czechs as well.
Mm-hmm. So now, I'm sorry, I lost the part here where, just to skip to the end here, you say that they were quietly disciplined. It also says here the case was closed in May 2021 and leadership decided against prosecution. So we don't have a court case. What evidence do we have? Where does your story come from here? Clearly you've interviewed people involved in great detail. So give us the background of, even, in fact, if you want, how you found out about this and decided to pursue this story.
Yeah, so I found out about it back in 2018. The New York Times had ran a series of stories basically saying that a Green Beret team was removed from Afghanistan. They didn't know why. They didn't know if they were involved in this beating death, but they knew that an Afghan commando was beat to death. And so I kind of marked it on my calendar. I wanted to FOIA for the Army criminal investigation into this incident and see if anything came of it. And they kept putting it off for basically, year after year after year. And then finally in spring of 2021, I got told that it was complete and I can file my FOIA request. So I did that. And I got back the entire case file for this criminal investigation. And what the Army Criminal Probe does is they basically just collect all the evidence and then they deliver that evidence to the soldiers' commanders. So they don't charge the soldiers and they don't recommend charges. They just gather up the evidence and say what they have. And so the commander in this case decided to hand these guys letters of reprimand that were permanently filed, meaning that it's kind of a career killer. So, one of these guys I know, the captain involved in this case, he voluntarily left the military, but his chances of advancement would probably be pretty limited to nil because of this reprimand in his file. And one of the reasons why they didn't go forward with actually charging them and putting them in a court case is because, well, there is a lot of evidence. Clearly, there's one witness that was inside the room with the Americans. He was the translator for the Americans. He told Army criminal investigators all about how they basically, brutally beat this guy in this room. And there was also blood evidence from that room. There was blood found on the ceiling. There was some blood found on the walls. Although it did look like the room was cleaned, according to the Army criminal investigators, there was some blood evidence left. The problem with the case, though, is that while it's true that the Americans questioned him, not long after the Americans questioned him, the Czech forces also questioned him. And the interpreter who basically turned witness in this case, he said that he also heard screaming from inside the room when the Czechs were questioning him. And on top of that, after they were done questioning this Afghan commando, they turned the Afghan back over to his own unit, and the Americans say that that's when the guy was actually beat. So the problem for a prosecutor in this case is basically there's 10 hours where this crime happened. There are 3 different nations, militaries, that have their hands and have custody over this guy at three different periods. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of dead space on kind of the whiteboard for a defense attorney to basically say, the death blows or the beating could have happened in any one of these guys' custodies, and the blood could be attributed just to the Czech forces when they questioned him. Mm-hmm. So the real problem is that it leaves doubt in any juror's mind, beyond the reasonable doubt that the Green Berets were the ones that were, unequivocally responsible for the death. So that's kind of the problem I think that the prosecutors faced, and I've been told, as much by different officials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are the economics of a lynching, right? Everybody's just a little bit responsible, and nobody can prove exactly any one person being more responsible than the others. And so, stoning someone to death. Which blow was the one that really did the job? Hard to say. Mm-hmm. Right. Very good. That's, the Green Berets. Now, is this the same famous Army Green Beret A-team that was, I wrote about in my book? That's I'm trying to remember now all the source material back then. These guys who had been caught killing quite a few people and bodies dug up on the side of their base and, just outside the fence and all that.
Like the same unit, you mean?
Yeah, I'm asking because you're saying that you had read about this Green Beret team that had been accused of these crimes. I was wondering if this was just one of that same scandal, or this may be a whole different group of guys.
A whole different group of guys.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that over the years in Iraq and Afghanistan, the treatment of detainees particularly has not been particularly a clean record.
That's certainly true. Okay, now but it's important too, as you stipulated here, that you're not just going off of some hearsay. You got all this from the Army documents of their criminal investigation here, and now. So all these quotes of the translator all come from the investigation, or you also tried to interview the guy, or?
I tried to reach out to the guy. I do know the company that he worked for. However, they were not able to give me his files. No, so all the quotes in that story from the translator come from his witness statement that he signed off and he gave to the Army criminal investigation.
I see. All right. But so this guy, is he still in Afghanistan, or he lives here now? The witness?
That's a question I really don't have an answer for. They wouldn't release to me the name of him. And the same thing with the Green Berets in this case. All the names were redacted from the case file. And I know their ranks, but, the Army wouldn't release the private information of them, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, according to the former chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, at that time, now retired, obviously, U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, 108, this was from an internal investigation, 108 people died in military custody of violent causes, not natural ones, but whether they were outright tortured to death or something approaching that, there were, we know for a fact there were at least 6 killed by the CIA during that time at a minimum. But there's at least 108, and the Associated Press later did their own story where they confirmed that same number. So I don't know if this was one of them or not. This may be the margin of error here, this poor guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a question of like what he would even have been considered at this point. He had only been in custody for about 10 hours, so would he even, be tracked as a detainee or a prisoner? It's tough to say, and I think that any sort of proper accounting of the number of detainees or prisoners of war who've been abused, and again, not they haven't been convicted in a court of law or proven to be totally guilty of whatever they've been accused of. I think it's up in the air how well these numbers can even be tracked when you have cases like this that, it happened at it towards the end of the war, right? 2018, as the war in Afghanistan on the U.S. side is really starting to peter off. The U.S. is entering negotiations with the Taliban. And so at this point, it becomes a lot more, there's a lot fewer U.S. troops in country. There's a little bit more of a stricter hold on them. And so some things that maybe could have gotten away with earlier in the war started to become a little bit harder to, I don't necessarily want to say cover up, but lose sight of, I guess, towards the end.
Yeah. Hang on just one second. Hey, y'all, the audiobook of my book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, is finally done. Yes, of course, read by me. It's available at Audible, Amazon, Apple Books, and soon on Google Play and whatever other options there are out there. It's my history of America's war on terrorism from 1979 through today. Give it a listen and see if you agree. It's time to just come home. Enough already. Time to end the war on terrorism. The audiobook. Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Hey guys, Scott Horton here for Listen and Think Libertarian Audiobooks. As you may know, the audiobook of my new book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, is finally out. It's co-produced by our longtime friends at Listen and Think Libertarian Audiobooks. For many years now, Derek Sheriff over there at Listen and Think has offered lifetime subscriptions to anyone who donates $100 or more to The Scott Horton Show at scotthorton.org/donate or to the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And they've got a bunch of great titles, including Inside Syria by the late, great Reese Erlich. That's listenandthink.com.
All right, so can you take us through the story of what happened to the guy? Now, apparently, part of the reason he was killed is because he wouldn't confess to working for the Taliban, because he didn't work for the Taliban, right? He just saw his shot and he took it. This is part of their, the consequences of their narrative building here, where, oh yeah, no, we're just here to help these people, and we pay these people to be in the Afghan army to protect their country. But in fact, they're traitors to their country, serving a foreign occupying army. And so no wonder they're dangerous when they're standing there frustrated that this is the only job they could get, but their heart's not in it at all. So he's not the only one to do one of these attacks who was never recruited by the Taliban to do so, but just did so when they, took the opportunity to go for it, like this guy apparently did. But then they wanted answers out of him, and he didn't have any answers, right? And so then tell us the story of actually what did happen to him, as best you can tell from the investigation here, if you could.
Yeah, I will. And it's tough. It's tough to get into the minds. It's a whole other culture. Why all these insider attacks have happened. It's kind of a strange phenomenon. Some of them are attributable to people who turned sides and joined the Taliban or were always members of the Taliban. Some of it has to do with perceived slights or fights that they had with U.S. forces. That said, this case is also kind of different because it happened from an Afghan commando, and the commando Kandaks, where these guys came from, were tended to be much better vetted, better trained, far more loyal, and they worked very well with U.S. forces, and they had good relationships. So it is kind of different in that respect, that it happened from an Afghan commando, not a generic line regular force Afghan soldier.
Right.
But that's some of the points you pointed to, like there's a lot of cultural issues in Afghanistan, and there's a lot of dynamics that just from us being totally foreign from this country probably have missed for years and years. But beyond that, the story basically goes that after the Afghans brought him over to the U.S. Camp, they turned him over to the Americans. The guy arrived not in uniform. He was in a tracksuit and sandals, and so that's a little strange. But he arrived, and they turned him over to the Americans. And the Americans, according to the translator, a lot of this is going to be according to the translator, just giving you a warning. According to the translator, the Americans took the guy to a little bit more of a remote part of the camp in order to kind of avoid the looky-loos and just the people standing around who didn't have anything to do. And so they started going through his personal belongings, like his cell phone, and looking for shreds of information. And while they did that, and the Green Berets were doing this, the Czechs took him into the interrogation room, and the translator was outside with the Green Berets. And at this point, he said he heard screaming from inside the interrogation room and stuff being thrown around. So it sounded like the Czechs were basically having their way with this guy. And as the Americans went through his belongings, they didn't really report finding anything, at least in the investigation. And so they ended up going to the room next. And the translator says that the Green Berets, at this point, began asking him questions, but they were also beating him. They, slammed his head against a table in the room, slammed his head against a breaker box. At one point, one of the Green Berets allegedly brandished a knife, said that he wants to slit the guy's throat if he doesn't answer his questions. Another Green Beret at that point told him to put the knife away. And this kind of went on for, according to the translator, roughly 30 minutes. And they didn't really get any information out of the guy. The guy confessed to doing the shooting, per the Green Berets' witness statements. He said that he wasn't a member of the Taliban and he had just made a mistake and he had gone crazy. It's kind of one of those strange, excuses that probably doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially, in that scenario. But, the guy was getting beat, so who knows exactly what his true motivation was or if he was even being transparent himself. But, regardless, the interrogation ended. The Green Berets decided they weren't really going to get any information out of him. And according to the translator, after this, when the last time he saw the prisoner in the yard outside of that interrogation room, the guy's face was swollen around his forehead, swollen around his eyes, and he was bleeding very heavily. And when they turned him back over to the Afghans after this had ended, the Afghans had allegedly put him in the bed of the truck rather than the cab of their truck because he was bleeding so heavily. And so that's basically where the actual allegations of the war crime against the U.S. forces end. And the Afghan was brought back to his camp. And later on that night, not more than a few hours later, the American camp gets a call and basically are told that the guy's dying and they need to bring him back over to the American facility in order to get medical care. And so they do that. They bring him back over to the surgical team that's on the American camp. And the surgical team says that when the guy arrived, he had like a nasal airway opener in his nasal passage, basically to help him breathe. He had, head dressing on, IV in his arm. So it seemed like the Afghans had basically tried to do life-saving measures on him. And it wasn't successful. The surgical team said that when the guy arrived, he had no pulse. So they were unable to resuscitate him at that point. So they declared time of death at that point. And the surgical team, didn't witness any of the alleged beatings. They just basically said that after, the guy died on their table, they asked the Afghans a little bit of questions. And the Afghans, not speaking very good English, just said, they beat him. And when the surgeon tried to ask a little more information, the guy just repeated they beat him. And so, from the Green Berets' perspective or from their witness statements, they say that at this point, when they were in the surgical room with the surgical team as they were taking care of this prisoner, they said that the Afghans had made comments about how everyone at the unit had a go, quote unquote, had a go at the prisoner. And so that's kind of implying that the Afghans were the ones that dealt out this beating. The translator, who was also present in the clinic, said that conversation never happened, and that was, not true. But, it becomes, again, kind of part of the difficulty of this case, kind of just a he said, she said thing. And the surgical team was too far away. They didn't hear the exchange. So that's really the end of the the story of the Afghan prisoner, unfortunately. And at that point, what was previously reported back in 2018 was the U.S. headquarters in Kabul, Afghanistan, the capital, got wind that this prisoner had died after this insider attack, that possibly Czech forces were involved, that possibly American forces were involved, and they withdrew the Green Beret team from the country. And then the investigation started for the next three and a half years.
Mm-hmm. And now, what was the Green Berets side of the story, or did they just shut up, or what?
They said that basically they did an interrogation with this guy, and they acknowledged that they took him in for questioning. They said it was very fruitless. The guy just said he went crazy. He had no real reasoning for why he did it. He didn't say he was a member of the Taliban or anything. And they ended the interrogation with, very little information being gleaned from it. And the Green Berets said that at that point, they turned him back over to the Czechs, let the Czechs talk to him a little bit more, and then they let him go over or they released him back into the custody of the Afghan forces. And the Green Berets said that the guy wasn't harmed while in either group's custody, and they never witnessed anyone harm him. And the Green Berets just stuck to the story that, from their understanding, it was the Afghans that beat the guy to death.
Yeah, plausible enough. Lord knows how many people, if 108 died in Iraq and Afghanistan under American military custody, Lord knows how many died under the control of our allies in the Iraqi army and militias, and in Afghanistan as well. I mean, especially in the early years of the Bagram prison and all of that. No one will ever be held accountable for all of what went on there. And for these same reasons, right? Oh, well, all we did was beat him up for the first 15 minutes, but those guys beat him up for the second 15 minutes, and so they could get away with it.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of telling that 1st Special Forces Command, which is the unit overseeing these Green Berets, did decide to issue reprimands in this case. I mean, they could have just dismissed it altogether.
That's true.
So,
right. In fact, that just establishes that they found this investigation, the same one you found, pretty credible themselves.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that they definitely found something happened in this room. We can't really prove it in a court of law, but we weren't happy with the way our Green Berets behaved in this scenario. And then one of the things that's also worth pointing out, and I spoke to a former Army JAG, an attorney for the Army. He is a retired colonel, but he had basically pointed out that it often becomes really difficult in all sorts of criminal cases that happen overseas to prosecute these cases, and even just to gather evidence and witness statements after you remove the people from the country. He's argued in the past, he said that it's important to move the court-martial system to the country where U.S. operations are taking place, because once you leave the country, you start having to deal with getting the witnesses visas in order to, bring them over for testimony. Mm-hmm. You have trouble with, investigators going out and gathering evidence, prosecutors doing their own digging, and I think some of those problems we'll run into in this case. Especially when you have 3 different foreign groups. You have Czechs, Afghans, and Americans. And the military justice system just has jurisdiction over the U.S. troops, right? So they can't really compel foreign forces in the same way that they could, have the sit-downs or gather the statements and, lean on the U.S. troops in the way that they tend to. So I think just the complicating factors of this, when it is a broad coalition of different forces, it introduces some trouble to the investigative process that, certainly wouldn't be present if this was something that happened just on U.S. soil and, involved like a bar fight that they're trying to, investigate the truth about.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but on behalf of all of America, we're trying very hard to forget that the Afghan war ever happened, or that there's anything about it that we need to know, or anybody who needs to be held accountable for anything that happened there. We're on to the next one. So keep up, Mr. Army Times guy.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I would just say, it is really important, I think, after these conflicts end to, not let them fall by the wayside and just, ignore the situations. And I would also like to add, just, I served in Afghanistan as like an enabler for a Green Beret team. I was in the Air Force, and I, went on patrols with them, and they were a very by the book professional group, and they handled detainees, and they did it very professionally. So I think it's important, just to note that there are incidents like this that happen, but I think it's also unfair to, just cast a wide net and assume that this is the way all teams would behave, because I don't think that is the case. And I think that my own personal experience interacting with a lot of Green Berets has been that, by and large, they are professionals and they are very good at what they do. And, I think they handle situations far better than this team handled it in this case.
Yeah, well, it all comes down to accountability, right? You're
True.
talking about an armed, lethal force. So they have to be under very tight control at all times, or else very bad things happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. All right. Well, so I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate your work on this story, a very important one. So thank you.
I appreciate you having me on. Thank you very much.
All right, you guys. That is Kyle Rempfer. He wrote this piece for ArmyTimes.com. 8 Green Berets quietly disciplined after Afghan prisoners beating death.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.